The ground did not tremble, it tore. A single shudder ripped across California's spine, splitting streets open like wounds, hurling brick and steel into the air, snapping the bones of a proud metropolis in less than a minute. San Francisco, jewel of the Pacific, became an inferno. Gas lines hissed, flames leapt, and entire districts vanished into a roar so violent it drowned out the screams. The quake had not ended. It had only set the stage. Fire marched across the city like an executioner, devouring Market Street, Chinatown, Nob Hill, sparing nothing, sparing no one. Water mains lay shattered, fire hoses useless. Soldiers blasted dynamite into their own neighborhoods to halt the blaze, but the flames laughed at them and spread wider. Refugees staggered through smoke-choked streets, eyes burning, clutching whatever fragments of life they could carry. By nightfall, the city glowed like a furnace visible for miles at sea. By morning, San Francisco was a skeletal ruin. Its skyline collapsed into ash. More than 3,000 dead, 200,000 homeless. A city mutilated beyond recognition. And yet in those ruins, something stirred, something ruthless, determined, unwilling to die. The city would rise again, but never as it was before. Beneath the waters of the Pacific, west of San Francisco, lies a scar cut into the crust of the earth itself. The San Andreas Fault, a fracture more than 800 miles long, stretching from Cape Mendocino in the north to the Mexican border in the south. It is not a single crack, but a shifting boundary between two massive tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate to the west and the North American Plate to the east. These plates grind past each other, locked in a slow, violent embrace, their tension building year after year until the rock can no longer hold. When that pressure is released, the ground itself lurches, ripping apart highways, railroads, and cities that lie above. The San Andreas is not silent. It has spoken before, and always with force. California has long known the violence of earthquakes. The first recorded tremor felt by settlers in the region occurred on July 28, 1769, when the Gaspar de Portola expedition camped near present-day Los Angeles. Soldiers noted the ground trembling beneath them, an unfamiliar force in a land still largely uncharted by Europeans. The missions that spread north through California recorded others. The quake of June 1838 struck near San Francisco, toppling adobe walls and frightening residents of the small pueblo. In 1868, the Hayward Fault, a branch of the Greater Fault System, released a 6.8 magnitude quake that devastated towns across the East Bay. San Francisco, then already climbing toward 150,000 residents, saw buildings collapse, chimneys crash through roofs, and businesses shutter. That quake was called the Great San Francisco Earthquake of its time. Yet it was only a prelude. By the final decades of the 19th century, San Francisco had transformed. Founded in 1776 with the Presidio and Mission Dolores, the city remained small until the world-changing discovery of gold in the Sierra Nevada in 1848. The California gold rush sent waves of fortune seekers. By 1850, nearly 25,000 people crammed into the city. Ships from every corner of the globe filled the harbor, so many that abandoned vessels were scuttled and buried to make way for new streets. By the 1870s and 1880s, San Francisco was the Pacific Coast metropolis. It boasted cable cars climbing its hills, a grand opera house, and financial institutions that linked Asia, Latin America, and Europe. By 1900, the city's population surpassed 400,000, making it the largest on the West Coast, a hub of trade, industry, and culture. Yet prosperity bred vulnerability. The boom of the gold rush, followed by waves of immigration, filled the city with hastily built wooden houses. Lumber was cheap, fast to erect, and easy to expand as neighborhoods spread across the hills. Rows upon rows of wooden homes stood shoulder to shoulder, often sharing walls, with narrow alleys and stairways threading between them. Entire districts, south of Market, Chinatown, the Western Addition, were dense grids of timber. Brick and stone were used for banks, hotels, and factories, but even these structures lacked steel reinforcement. They crumbled when shaken. The city's fire defenses lagged far behind its growth. San Francisco depended on a network of underground water mains and cisterns scattered throughout neighborhoods, but many were aging and poorly maintained. Hydrants dotted the streets, yet their reliability was far from certain. The San Francisco Fire Department, though brave and dedicated, was small compared to the city's sprawl. Firefighting equipment, steam-powered pumpers pulled by horses, struggled against the scale of the dense urban fabric. In the 1890s and early 1900s, several smaller fires had already hinted at how easily the city could burn. The geography of San Francisco itself magnified the risks. Hills forced construction into tight corridors, funneling winds through the city. Warehouses on the waterfront stored coal, oil, and explosives. Gas mains and electric lines crisscrossed neighborhoods. In 1900, San Francisco consumed 16 million gallons of water daily, but much of that supply depended on pipes vulnerable to rupture during seismic shock. The Presidio military base, occupying the city's northern edge, offered soldiers and discipline, but it was not designed to coordinate relief for a catastrophe of massive scale. Earthquakes remained an ominous memory rather than an active fear. Many remembered the 1868 Hayward shock, which had shattered windows and killed around 30 people, but the urgency of urban growth eclipsed concerns about seismic safety. No building codes enforced quake-resistant design. Insurance companies, banks, and city leaders focused on profit and expansion. The hills of San Francisco were carved into lots, its shoreline filled with earth and rubble to create new districts like the Financial District and parts of south of Market. Much of that landfill was unstable, made from sand, refuse, and broken ships, waiting to liquefy under violent shaking. By the turn of the century, San Francisco stood as a paradox. It was the crown jewel of the West, its skyline defined by the ferry building at the foot of Market Street and the hotels rising on Nob Hill. Cable cars clattered daily, merchants lined the streets, and theaters drew crowds at night. Yet beneath its wealth and confidence, it rested on a fragile foundation, physically and structurally. A sleeping fault, stretching silently beneath the Golden Gate, carried within it centuries of stored pressure. Each year, the Pacific Plate crept northwestward against the North American Plate, grinding, halting, locking. That pressure accumulated in silence. No one in the city could see the hidden clock counting down. The San Andreas had last released its energy in a great rupture around 1857, when the southern segment broke in the so-called Fort Tejon earthquake, tearing through 225 miles of fault in central California. In San Francisco, the tremors were felt but caused little harm. Nearly 50 years had passed since then, and the northern segment had grown restless. Scientists of the era, like Andrew Lawson of the University of California, had begun charting the fault, but seismology remained a young discipline. Most residents thought of earthquakes as minor nuisances, occasional rattles, nothing more. San Francisco continued to grow upward and outward, unaware that its very success had set the stage for its greatest vulnerability. The city's wooden core, its tangled streets, its broken water mains, and its landfill foundation stood as an open invitation to disaster. The San Andreas Fault waited beneath, patient, indifferent, stretching its hand from beneath the Golden Gate, ready to remind California that the ground beneath was never stable, never safe, never still. At precisely 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the locked crust of California gave way. The rupture began offshore near San Francisco, a violent tear along the San Andreas Fault that raced north toward Mendocino and south as far as San Juan Bautista. For nearly 300 miles, the earth split and lurched, a rupture so immense that fence lines shifted several yards, river courses altered, and the ground itself seemed to slide beneath the feet of anyone standing upon it. Modern seismologists measure the quake at magnitude 7.8, but numbers alone cannot convey what it meant for the city at its epicenter. San Francisco had been roused by an event so sudden, so overwhelming, that many survivors later recalled not knowing whether it was the world itself ending. The first shock threw people from their beds, hurling them against walls and floors. In the seconds that followed, walls cracked open, plaster rained down, and roofs collapsed over families still struggling to stand. Streets rose and fell in waves. Pavement buckled into jagged ridges. Across the city, horses bolted from their stables in panic, wagons overturned, and carriages were flung into the air. Telegraph lines snapped instantly, silencing communication before officials could send a single report. San Francisco was plunged into isolation within moments. In the heart of the city, buildings designed to symbolize wealth and permanence crumbled like sand. On Market Street, masonry storefronts shattered, facades fell outward, and entire blocks seemed to disintegrate at once. The Palace Hotel, an emblem of San Francisco's prosperity, shook so violently that its guests fled barefoot into the streets, glass slicing their feet as windows exploded around them. The Call Building, one of the tallest skyscrapers on the Pacific coast at the time, swayed alarmingly, but somehow remained standing. The tremors reached far beyond the city. In Santa Rosa, some 50 miles north, nearly the entire downtown collapsed within seconds, killing scores. To the south in San Jose, brick buildings crumbled, and at Stanford University, the Grand Memorial Arch at the campus entrance shattered into rubble, while walls of the Memorial Church split open. Across California, from Mendocino in the north to the agricultural valley south of San Francisco, towns awoke to destruction. Railroads bent under the strain of the Earth's shifting plates. Tracks twisted into useless spirals, locomotives derailed where they stood, and bridges were wrenched from their foundations. Telegraph poles tilted at odd angles, lines torn down for hundreds of miles. The quake was not a localized disaster, but a regional convulsion, leaving scars across the length of California's northern coast. Yet it was San Francisco that bore the greatest weight of destruction. Eyewitnesses spoke of streets heaving as if they were waves of the sea, a description repeated again and again in testimony gathered later by state geologist Andrew Lawson. Lawson himself walked the rupture line afterward, tracing the Earth's displacement for hundreds of miles. But in those first minutes, no one could measure anything. The only measure was chaos. People ran into the open, colliding with neighbors equally dazed. Families scrambled to pull children from wrecked houses. Workers already in bakeries and factories were crushed by collapsing chimneys and falling brick. On Howard Street, entire rows of boarding houses fell flat, trapping those inside beneath timber and dust. Survivors clawed at the wreckage with bare hands, trying to reach those crying out. The destruction came with startling speed. The shaking lasted less than a minute, yet within that short span, the city was broken. Church steeples toppled, their bells silenced under rubble. Water mains burst, flooding streets in some areas, but leaving hydrants dry where they would soon be needed most. Gas pipes ruptured, filling the air with the hiss of escaping fuel. The city, stunned by the quake, was already preparing to ignite. From Chinatown to Nob Hill, from the south of Market to the Western Addition, the pattern repeated. Wooden houses shifted off their foundations, stairways tore loose, and brick cornices tumbled onto passers-by. In the Mission District, the ground opened in fissures wide enough to swallow entire fences. Near the waterfront, reclaimed land built on old marshes and buried ships slumped and buckled, structures sinking unevenly as the ground liquefied beneath them. Survivors later recalled the disorienting silence after the first shock, broken only by the cries of the injured and the distant neighing of terrified horses. Then came the aftershocks. Just minutes after the main rupture, secondary tremors rattled the city again, further weakening buildings already on the verge of collapse. People who had rushed into the streets clutched at lampposts and telegraph poles as the ground lurched beneath them once more. The destruction was not limited to buildings. The very geography of California bore new scars. Along the San Andreas Fault Line, farmers reported their land had shifted by as much as 20 feet. In Marin County, roads that once ran straight were offset in sudden bends, fences torn apart and misaligned. Near Olima, the rupture line cut clean through fields and forests, a jagged wound stretching as far as the eye could follow. The rupture's full length, nearly 300 miles, was one of the longest ever recorded. In the city, however, human cost overshadowed all. Families huddled in the streets, clutching what belongings they had managed to snatch in those seconds of terror. Some stood barefoot, wrapped in blankets, staring at homes reduced to rubble. Others screamed names of relatives, searching frantically through debris. Fires had not yet spread across the city, but the threat was already present, the broken gas mains waiting for a single spark. By sunrise, San Francisco was a city torn open, its skyline fractured, its infrastructure severed, its citizens stunned into disbelief. But the quake itself, devastating though it was, had only opened the door to the catastrophe that was about to follow. The true ordeal had only just begun. The quake had broken the city, but the fires would consume it. Within minutes of the Earth's rupture on April 18, 1906, flames began to rise. Gas mains beneath San Francisco had snapped in every district, releasing streams of fuel that hissed and ignited. Stoves and lamps overturned inside collapsing kitchens, and parlors became instant torches. Sparks fell onto shattered timbers, and flames spread from house to house. The city, built largely of wood and packed tightly block after block, was primed to burn. By 5:30 a.m., the first reports of fire came from the south of Market District, where warehouses, boarding houses, and factories crowded together on unstable ground. Almost immediately, new fires broke out in Chinatown, on Hayes Valley, and near the waterfront. Market Street, the city's great commercial spine, became a corridor of flame. The destruction multiplied with terrifying speed, not because the firefighters lacked courage, but because the earthquake had crippled their only lifeline, water. When Chief Engineer Dennis Sullivan of the San Francisco Fire Department was mortally injured by falling debris during the initial quake, the department lost its leader. The men who remained rushed to fight the blazes, but found hydrants dry. The quake had ruptured most of the city's water mains, leaving only a scattering of cisterns filled. Some hydrants sputtered weakly, but many yielded nothing at all. Hose lines were laid across blocks, but they connected to emptiness. Firefighters stood in the face of an advancing inferno with no weapons but axes and their own bodies. By late morning, the fires had grown into an unstoppable front. Entire blocks on Market Street burned simultaneously. Merchants tried to save their goods, dragging trunks and crates into the open, only to see them consumed in the streets. On Nob Hill, where the city's wealthiest families had built their mansions, flames reached upward, feeding on carved wood and fine draperies. The grand hotels, the Fairmont, the Mark Hopkins, the Stanford, stood like monuments to opulence, but even stone walls could not withstand the inferno's heat. Fire leapt from building to building until the hill itself glowed. In Chinatown, the devastation was absolute. The tightly packed district, its wooden balconies stacked one above another, was swallowed by flame. Within hours, the neighborhood was gone. Efforts to contain the fire there were futile. The hydrants yielded no water, and soldiers stationed nearby could only force evacuations. Residents carried what they could on their backs, streaming out into open spaces as the heart of their community burned to the ground. The south of Market District, filled with warehouses and industrial yards, became another furnace. Coal, kerosene, and lumber fueled the advancing wall of flame. Fire jumped across wide streets, carried by embers and gusts of heat. Warehouses erupted in bursts of explosions, scattering burning debris onto rooftops blocks away. Desperate measures followed. The army, acting under General Frederick Funston, took control of large parts of the city. Troops marched into districts with orders to maintain order, prevent looting, and assist in firefighting efforts. Without water to fight the flames, soldiers and firefighters resorted to dynamite. Entire blocks were blown apart in the attempt to create fire breaks, gaps in the city where nothing remained to burn. On some streets, this worked. On others, it backfired. The blast sent embers high into the air, igniting more fires than they contained. Families who had survived the earthquake saw their homes destroyed not by flames, but by deliberate demolition. By the end of the first day, fires raged unchecked across a swath of the city nearly 3 miles long. The flames consumed Nob Hill entirely, swept down through south of Market, and carved a path through Chinatown toward Telegraph Hill. They pushed relentlessly westward toward Van Ness Avenue, where wider streets and open spaces offered a final hope of containment. Thousands fled into Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and the Shoreline, carrying bundles, children, and in some cases nothing at all. On April 19th, the second day, the firestorm continued to spread. Aftershocks rattled the weakened city, collapsing more structures into the flames. The Hall of Justice, the City Hall with its massive dome, and countless public buildings fell to fire. The Palace Hotel, once the pride of San Francisco, became a smoldering ruin. Flames engulfed the financial district, toppling banks and offices. Smoke darkened the sky, visible for miles out to sea, where naval ships arriving to assist could see the outline of the city aflame. Dynamiting continued under Army command. On Van Ness Avenue, blocks of homes were obliterated in an effort to halt the flames' march westward. The avenue became the critical line of defense. Soldiers, police, and firefighters stood in streets littered with debris, waiting for the flames to reach the blasted gaps. For hours, the city's fate seemed uncertain. By April 20th, the third day, the fire reached its greatest intensity. More than 500 city blocks were ablaze. Refugee camps swelled in Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and along the waterfront, where tens of thousands slept under makeshift tents. Food and water grew scarce. Yet still, the flames moved forward. On Nob Hill, the Grand Stanford Mansion had collapsed in a roar of fire. On Market Street, nothing remained but charred ruins. Finally, by April 21st, the advance began to slow. Dynamite lines on Van Ness Avenue held. The surviving water system allowed firefighters to hold certain hydrants, most famously at the corner of 20th and Church Streets, where a single working hydrant supplied enough water to save an entire district. Slowly, methodically, the flames consumed what remained in their path until they had nothing left to claim. In total, the fire burned for 3 days and nights, reducing over 28,000 buildings to ash. The destroyed area spanned nearly 5 square miles, encompassing the city's core. Nob Hill was gutted, Chinatown erased, south of Market flattened, the financial district shattered. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist, their boundaries marked only by charred ruins. The geography of destruction was not uniform. Some areas, like the Western Addition and parts of the Mission District, were spared, either by chance or by the barriers created. But the heart of San Francisco had been carved out by fire. The quake had shattered the city, but it was the firestorm that finished the work, transforming a thriving metropolis into a blackened ruin. Families stood in open spaces, staring at a skyline stripped of its landmarks. The city's wooden bones had been consumed, its proud stone monuments gutted, its lifelines severed. In those 4 days, San Francisco became a furnace, and from its ashes, the question of survival and rebuilding loomed over every survivor. When the firestorm raged unchecked across San Francisco after the earthquake of April 18, 1906, survival meant movement. Entire families poured into the streets, dragging carts, pushing wheelbarrows, or carrying bundles on their backs. Some had nothing but the clothes they wore. Others clutched small boxes of jewelry, photographs, or family Bibles, refusing to let their past vanish in the flames. By the tens of thousands, they moved westward and northward, away from the advancing inferno, seeking refuge in the city's open spaces. Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and the waterfront became vast fields of the displaced. Golden Gate Park, normally a landscaped refuge for leisure, transformed overnight into a camp of desperate humanity. Lawns and pathways filled with families erecting makeshift shelters from blankets, canvas, and salvaged lumber. By the second day, more than 200,000 people, over half the city's population, were homeless. Refugees lay shoulder to shoulder on the grass, while cooking fires dotted the open fields. The Presidio, still an active military post, became both sanctuary and staging ground. Soldiers directed the flood of civilians into organized rows of tents. Military order imposed structure on chaos, but the sheer scale of need overwhelmed even disciplined ranks. Food lines formed quickly. With the city's supply chains severed, distribution fell into the hands of the army and local relief committees. The federal government moved fast. Rations of bread, canned goods, and condensed milk arrived by rail and sea. Army kitchens ladled out soup to thousands at a time. Refugees queued for hours, tin cups in hand, grateful for a portion that kept them alive another day. Water, more precious than food in those first weeks, came in barrels hauled from undamaged reservoirs outside the city. Martial law was never formally declared, but General Frederick Funston and his troops acted as if it had been. Soldiers patrolled the streets with rifles, enforcing curfews and guarding warehouses. Looting was punished harshly. Several men caught stealing were shot without trial, their deaths recorded in terse military reports. The intention was deterrence in a city stripped of police presence and civil order. To the thousands of refugees, the army represented both protection and authority. Discipline maintained order in food distribution, kept the camps secure, and gave the displaced a structure within which to endure the crisis. The tent cities grew with startling speed. In Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and smaller squares like Jefferson Square and Portsmouth Square, rows of army tents were erected. Families huddled together under canvas roofs. Laundry hung between poles, children played among the encampments, and kitchens were fashioned from scavenged brick and metal. Relief organizations such as the Red Cross and local charities distributed clothing, bedding, and medicine. By May, official records counted nearly 20,000 tents erected across the city. These camps were not temporary in the short sense. Many families would live under canvas for months, some for more than a year. Amid the hardship, resilience emerged. Neighborhood groups organized themselves. In the Mission District, spared much of the fire, residents set up communal kitchens, feeding not only themselves, but also refugees from burned districts. Churches opened their grounds for shelter, distributing supplies when they could. Ethnic communities, particularly Italian and Chinese immigrants, pooled resources to keep their own people alive. On the slopes of Telegraph Hill, residents famously fought to save their homes by draping wet blankets over rooftops and forming bucket brigades. Against all odds, that neighborhood survived largely intact. Elsewhere, desperation forced hard decisions. Families scavenged wood from the ruins to build crude shelters. Others tore apart damaged homes in unburned districts, stripping timbers to construct shacks near the refugee camps. The city itself sanctioned this improvisation. By summer 1906, the earthquake cottages, small wooden shelters built by the army and city officials, began to appear, offering slightly more permanent relief. Painted green, they dotted Golden Gate Park and other open spaces, symbols of both displacement and survival. Health concerns mounted quickly. With thousands crowded together in unsanitary conditions, disease threatened. Physicians warned of typhoid and dysentery, and strict controls were imposed. Latrines were dug in rows, garbage collected daily, and fresh water supplied under guard. The measures worked. Contrary to fears, San Francisco avoided large-scale epidemics. Yet the psychological toll was immense. Families who had owned homes, businesses, and wealth now stood in ration lines, living under army tents. The earthquake and fire had erased social distinctions. Bankers and laborers alike queued for the same soup. The waterfront became another axis of survival. Refugees camped along the Embarcadero and at Fort Mason, where supplies could be unloaded directly from ships. Naval vessels anchored in the bay provided medical aid, rations, and security. From the water, observers saw the entire city center still smoking, its ruins stretching in all directions, a constant reminder to those crowded in camps of what they had lost. Stories of endurance surfaced everywhere. In the Richmond district, which escaped the worst of the fire, neighbors opened their homes to strangers. In the Western Addition, small pockets of intact housing became havens, hosting extended families under single roofs. Yet resilience did not erase the desperation. Many left the city entirely, boarding trains and ferries to Oakland, Berkeley, and farther afield. By some estimates, nearly 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city's pre-quake population, fled permanently in the weeks after the disaster, scattering San Franciscans across California and beyond. Still, for those who stayed, the camps became the new reality. Daily life revolved around ration schedules, army inspections, and relief committee orders. Schools were reopened under canvas, with children seated on benches fashioned from scrap wood. Churches held services in tents. Newspapers resumed publication using presses salvaged from the ruins, circulated among the camps as proof that the city's civic fabric, though torn, still existed. The human landscape of survival was marked by contrasts. In Golden Gate Park, the wealthy who had fled mansions on Nob Hill lived yards away from working-class laborers displaced from south of Market. The catastrophe had stripped away boundaries, forcing San Franciscans into a shared fate. The Presidio's parade grounds, once the site of military drills, became a vast civilian encampment where languages from across the globe mingled. San Francisco had been a city of immigrants before the quake. Now it was a city of refugees, its population concentrated in sprawling camps where survival was the only measure of status. The earthquake and fire had left the city a shell, But the days that followed proved that survival required more than endurance. It demanded adaptation, organization in the face of collapse, resilience in the absence of homes, and discipline when chaos threatened to consume the ruins left behind. The earthquake of April 18, 1906, and the inferno that followed, left behind not just ruins, but an accounting of loss so vast it tested the limits of comprehension. The human toll was immediate and brutal. Official figures at the time listed 478 dead, but those numbers were deliberate understatements, crafted by city leaders desperate to protect San Francisco's reputation as a safe place for investment. Careful later studies, based on coroner's records, refugee reports, and municipal archives, revealed a different reality. More than 3,000 people perished in the disaster. Some suffocated under collapsed masonry, some were burned alive in the firestorm, others succumbed in hospitals days later from injuries that could not be treated in overwhelmed facilities. The majority of deaths were concentrated in Chinatown, south of Market, and the crowded working-class districts where wooden structures collapsed and fire spread too swiftly for escape. Thousands more were injured. Crushed limbs, broken spines, deep burns, and untreated wounds became the physical signatures of survival. The scale of homelessness was staggering. Within 24 hours, over 200,000 people, more than half the city's population, had lost their homes. They slept in Golden Gate Park, in the Presidio, and along the waterfront, where row upon row of tents formed a new, temporary San Francisco. Families who had owned substantial houses now lived beside laborers in army-issued canvas shelters. The social order that had divided the city so sharply before the quake collapsed along with its buildings. Wealthy residents of Nob Hill stood in ration lines beside longshoremen and Chinese immigrants, all reduced to a shared status of the displaced. Economic destruction compounded the human catastrophe. Estimates of the total cost exceeded $400 million in 1906 dollars, more than $12 billion in modern value. This was not merely the collapse of buildings and infrastructure. It was the loss of entire commercial districts, warehouses of goods, and financial institutions whose ledgers turned to ash. The earthquake shattered gas mains and water lines, but the fire obliterated banks, department stores, and factories. San Francisco's proud City Hall, completed only a decade earlier at enormous expense, lay in ruins. Nearly every major hotel downtown was destroyed. On Market Street, the heart of the city's commercial life, block after block was reduced to charred shells. The financial aftermath revealed a second struggle, one fought not with flames, but with contracts and legal clauses. Insurance had been the lifeline of San Francisco's rapid expansion at the turn of the century, and nearly every homeowner and business owner carried policies. But the disaster created a devastating ambiguity. Were the losses caused by earthquake or by fire? Most insurance companies had written policies that excluded earthquake damage. Yet nearly all the destruction had been caused by the fires ignited after the quake. The distinction became the battlefield. British and European insurers, who had written large portions of San Francisco's coverage, refused to pay claims they categorized as earthquake losses. American companies faced pressure from both policyholders and government officials to honor claims. The result was a bitter struggle. Some firms collapsed under the sheer volume of demands, while others paid only partial settlements. Policyholders fought in courts, and bitterness spread as families who had lost everything faced financial ruin a second time at the hands of insurance disputes. Eventually, about $235 million was paid out, but it was uneven and resentment lingered. The insurance conflict exposed the fragile foundation of modern urban growth, showing how a single disaster could unravel not only physical structures, but financial systems designed to protect them. The scale of San Francisco's devastation invited comparisons with other urban catastrophes. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 had destroyed more than 3 square miles of that city, killing an estimated 300 people and leaving 100,000 homeless. Chicago had rebuilt rapidly, emerging as a center of modern architecture and commerce. San Francisco's leaders studied that precedent with urgency, but the Californian disaster dwarfed Chicago's in terms of loss of life, scale of destruction, and the combination of quake and fire that made rebuilding vastly more complicated. 17 years after San Francisco, Tokyo would experience its own cataclysm. On September 1st, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake killed more than 100,000 people and leveled much of the Japanese capital. Comparisons between Tokyo and San Francisco revealed the cruel arithmetic of geography. Where Chicago had burned and San Francisco had both shaken and burned, Tokyo was shaken, burned, and engulfed by mass casualties. Yet in 1906, San Francisco's disaster was unparalleled in the American imagination, and it stood as a warning of what nature could do to even the most confident modern city. Counting the cost also meant reckoning with infrastructure. More than 28,000 buildings were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods, Chinatown, south of Market, Nob Hill, the Western Addition, were reduced to ashes. The city's gas and water systems had to be rebuilt from scratch. Streetcar lines lay twisted, sewer systems shattered. Telegraph and telephone service collapsed instantly after the quake, severing communication not just within the city, but with the outside world. Railroads halted for days as tracks buckled and bridges collapsed. San Francisco, which had been a hub of Pacific commerce, was cut off from the nation it served. The disaster also reshaped the city's demographics. Refugees who fled across the bay to Oakland and Berkeley swelled those towns almost overnight. Some never returned, altering the balance of the Bay Area permanently. Others left California altogether, scattering San Franciscans across the United States. The city that had once been a magnet for immigrants, fortune seekers, and entrepreneurs now dispersed its people like seeds in the wind, reshaping communities far beyond its charred limits. Yet in all the measurements, lives lost, buildings destroyed, dollars erased, the numbers tell only part of the devastation. Behind every statistic was a family separated, a business ruined, a community displaced. The official tally of 3,000 dead could not capture the unidentified bodies buried quickly in mass graves, nor the missing whose remains were never found among the rubble. The $400 million in losses did not account for the heirlooms, manuscripts, artworks, and personal histories consumed by the flames. What endured was an emptiness carved into the city's identity, a scar that no insurance settlement could erase. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 was not just a natural disaster. It was a collision between human ambition and the forces of the earth, a test of a city that had risen quickly on the edge of a fault line. Its cost was measured not only in ruined buildings and lost dollars, but in the very redefinition of what it meant to be a modern metropolis vulnerable to nature's power. The geography of destruction in San Francisco after April 18, 1906, was not random chaos but a clear, brutal pattern etched across the city's map. The earthquake shook every neighborhood, but it was the fire that decided which streets would be erased and which would endure. Over 4 square miles of the city burned, stretching from the waterfront through the downtown core, across Nob Hill, and into the Western Addition. The heart of San Francisco's commercial and cultural life was consumed. Maps produced in the aftermath shaded the burned districts in black, and the result was a haunting image, a dense swath covering most of the city's center, while the edges, like the Richmond, Sunset, and small parts of North Beach, remained as islands of survival. These maps became more than cartographic records. They were instruments of planning, symbols of loss, and blueprints for rebuilding. Chinatown sat squarely within the burned zone. Every building of this community, one of the largest concentrations of Chinese immigrants outside Asia, was destroyed. The fire did not discriminate between temples, restaurants, boarding houses, or markets. The catastrophe gave city officials and business leaders an opening they had long desired. For years, many had seen Chinatown as an embarrassment, a densely packed neighborhood marked by poverty in the eyes of outsiders, but also a cultural enclave they neither welcomed nor integrated. In the days after the quake, proposals circulated to relocate Chinatown entirely, out to the city's margins or across the bay. Developers envisioned replacing it with a grand commercial district, expanding the downtown core into what they considered prime real estate. But geography and politics collided with resilience. Chinese community leaders, with the support of the Qing government's consul in San Francisco, resisted displacement. They argued that Chinatown was not just a district, but a cultural and economic hub tied to the city's identity. Pressure from the Chinese community, combined with international diplomatic influence, blocked the relocation plan. When rebuilding began, Chinatown rose again on its original site. Yet it did not return unchanged. This time, architects, many hired by Chinese merchants, redesigned the district with ornate facades, pagoda-style roofs, and decorative elements that had never existed in the original buildings. What had been a neighborhood shaped by necessity and overcrowding was transformed into a deliberate cultural landmark. The new Chinatown was both an assertion of survival and a concession to the tourist gaze. A community rebuilt on its ashes, but also reshaped to fit the expectations of those who once sought its removal. Beyond Chinatown, the destruction forced the city to reconsider its very structure. Before the earthquake, San Francisco had grown with little regard for planning. Streets followed the hills with steep grades, wooden homes pressed together in fire-prone clusters, and building codes were inconsistently enforced. The quake and fire stripped away any illusions of safety. The city was forced to confront the physical weaknesses exposed by the disaster. In the rebuilding, new zoning laws emerged, pushing factories and warehouses away from residential districts. Fireproofing requirements were expanded, demanding the use of steel and reinforced concrete for downtown structures. Height limits were debated, though ultimately San Francisco continued to build upward, driven by its role as a financial hub. The geography of opportunity also lay in transportation. The quake destroyed much of the cable car system and streetcar lines, but rebuilding allowed engineers to modernize routes and extend them into neighborhoods that had survived relatively intact. This expansion encouraged the development of the western districts, such as the Sunset and Richmond, where sand dunes and farmland were gradually converted into residential blocks. The destruction of the city's core unintentionally pushed growth outward, altering the balance between downtown and outlying districts. The earthquake became not only an urban catastrophe, but a catalyst for the geographic expansion of San Francisco. Amid this rebuilding, a scientific revolution was quietly unfolding. The 1906 earthquake marked a turning point in the global understanding of seismic geography. For the first time, scientists could study a major quake with modern instruments and systematic observation. Professor Andrew Lawson of the University of California, Berkeley, led a statewide investigation known as the Lawson Report, published in 1908. This monumental study mapped the rupture of the San Andreas Fault across nearly 300 miles, from San Juan Bautista in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north. It was the first clear demonstration that earthquakes were linked to fault movement, not mysterious subterranean forces as often believed before. The report documented horizontal displacement of as much as 20 feet in rural areas north of San Francisco. Fences offset, roads twisted, and streams diverted. This evidence was irrefutable. California's landscape was not fixed, but constantly reshaped by tectonic forces. Modern seismology was born out of this realization. Lawson's team installed seismic instruments across the state, laying the foundation for a scientific network that would monitor tremors in real time. The earthquake transformed California into a living laboratory, where the relationship between geology and urban life could no longer be ignored. San Francisco's rebuilding incorporated some of these new insights, though often unevenly. Building codes grew stricter, but enforcement remained inconsistent under the pressure of rapid reconstruction. Engineers advocated for reinforced concrete and steel frames, technologies already in use in Chicago and New York, but many smaller builders still used wood. The geography of destruction served as a warning, yet economic pressures encouraged shortcuts. Even so, the overall cityscape shifted. Broader streets in some areas, better fire breaks, and sturdier commercial buildings marked a conscious effort to balance growth with safety. The earthquake also reshaped the geography of perception. Maps of the burned districts circulated widely in newspapers and reports, transforming San Francisco into a case study for cities worldwide. Urban planners in Tokyo, London, and Mexico City examined the patterns of destruction to consider their own vulnerabilities. In this way, the geography of San Francisco's disaster became part of a global conversation about modern urban resilience. The lines between destruction and opportunity blurred in every decision. The blackened core of the city was both a wound and a blank slate. The obliteration of Chinatown threatened cultural erasure, but ultimately produced one of the most iconic ethnic enclaves in America. The rubble of Market Street was a symbol of failure, but also an invitation to rebuild with taller, stronger structures. The San Andreas Fault, once invisible, now stood as a permanent geographic boundary shaping the city's destiny. San Francisco in 1906 was not just recovering from an earthquake, it was redefining the relationship between urban life and the unstable earth beneath it. The ashes of April 1906 did not linger long before the sound of rebuilding filled San Francisco streets. Within days of the fire being extinguished, lumber wagons, brick carts, and steel shipments poured into the city. By May, tents and temporary wooden structures lined Market Street, housing banks, businesses, and restaurants determined not to lose their footing. The will to restore the city was immediate, but the process between 1906 and 1915 was more than reconstruction. It was a complete transformation, reshaping San Francisco into a city that would be unrecognizable to those who had known its antebellum form. The scale of rebuilding required both urgency and ambition. Over 28,000 buildings had been destroyed. Housing more than 200,000 homeless residents demanded immediate action, and by summer of 1906, refugee camps had been established in Golden Gate Park, Presidio, and across vacant lots. Rows of Army-issued tents were replaced within months by earthquake cottages, small wooden houses built quickly, painted green, and rented out for $2 a month until families could move back into permanent homes. These cottages, modest and plain, symbolized the city's determination to shelter its people while laying the groundwork for long-term recovery. Many still survive today, silent witnesses to a desperate chapter of improvisation. Meanwhile, downtown was being cleared and reimagined. Business leaders, led by the influential Committee of 50 and major banks, understood that time was money. Insurance settlements were being contested, but capital nonetheless began flowing back into the city. By late 1906, steel and concrete, materials far stronger than wood, were being imported in unprecedented quantities. The skyline that emerged was one of America's first true experiments with modern, fireproof architecture. Reinforced steel frame buildings became the standard for the city center, pushing San Francisco into alignment with the architectural revolutions already underway in Chicago and New York. The new structures spoke not only to safety but to ambition. The Chronicle Building and the Call Building, both damaged in the quake, were rebuilt and modernized. The Fairmont Hotel, perched on Nob Hill, had been gutted by fire just days after its completion. In 1907 it reopened, stronger than before, instantly reclaiming its place as one of the most prestigious hotels in the West. Union Square and Market Street filled with new commercial blocks whose facades bore the influence of Beaux-Arts design, grand columns, broad arches, and ornate details that conveyed both wealth and permanence. At the civic level, the rebuilding process carried even greater symbolism. The old City Hall, a massive domed structure begun in the 1870s, collapsed in the quake, leaving behind a pile of ruins that became an emblem of municipal weakness. Its replacement, designed in the Beaux-Arts style, took nearly a decade to complete. The new City Hall, with its dome larger than the U.S. Capitol's, was inaugurated in 1915. It stood as the architectural centerpiece of a reimagined civic center, surrounded by new municipal buildings, wide boulevards, and open plazas that spoke to the influence of the City Beautiful movement. For reformers and planners, San Francisco was no longer a frontier boomtown scarred by fire. It was to be a modern metropolis, disciplined in form and grandeur. Street layouts, too, were altered by necessity. Fire had consumed many of the city's narrow passages, offering planners a chance to widen streets and impose order on districts once marked by haphazard growth. While many of the original grid lines survived, Market Street was restructured as a wide commercial artery lined with modern streetcars. New fire breaks and open spaces were incorporated into plans, with the intent of preventing any future firestorm from spreading unchecked. Yet rebuilding was not uniform. Wealthy districts such as Nob Hill rose quickly, their mansions rebuilt or replaced with luxury apartments, while working-class areas rebuilt more slowly. Chinese merchants, forced to fight for the right to remain in Chinatown, invested heavily in ornate reconstruction, producing the district's now iconic pagoda roofs and dragon gates. Italian North Beach, less affected by the fire, became a refuge for displaced families and grew rapidly as a result. The city's geography of class and ethnicity shifted subtly, shaped by the uneven pace of reconstruction and the political decisions about which areas received infrastructure first. By 1909, San Francisco's economy was surging once more. The rebuilding had attracted laborers, architects, and engineers from across the country. It had also drawn investment, as the city's port remained one of the busiest on the Pacific. Financial institutions re-established their dominance on Montgomery Street, while new theaters and hotels gave a cultural vibrancy to the downtown district. The population, which had fled in the weeks after the quake, returned in force, and by 1910 San Francisco had not only recovered its pre-earthquake numbers, but exceeded them. It was in this climate of confidence that city leaders sought a stage to announce San Francisco's rebirth to the world. The chosen symbol was the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a World's Fair timed to coincide with the completion of the Panama Canal. On February 20th, 1915, the exposition opened in a newly developed stretch of land at the northern edge of the city, today known as the Marina District. The fairgrounds covered 635 acres and were filled with grand pavilions, palaces of industry, and cultural displays from across the globe. The centerpiece was the Tower of Jewels, a 435-foot-high structure adorned with over 100,000 cut glass, Nova gems, that sparkled in the sunlight by day and glowed under searchlights by night. The Palace of Fine Arts, with its monumental colonnades and rotunda, was built as a temple to culture, and unlike most exposition structures, it would remain as a permanent landmark long after the fair ended. The exposition grounds showcased not only global exhibits, but also San Francisco's triumph. In less than a decade, the city had turned catastrophe into an opportunity to assert itself as the cultural and economic capital of the Pacific.